I thought I was being careful, responsible, kind. I believed that holding everything together was a virtue. That sacrificing parts of myself was the price of adulthood. That if I endured quietly long enough, things would eventually make sense. They didn't. I didn't destroy my life in a moment of recklessness. I dismantled myself slowly, politely, with good intentions. Every decision I made was meant to protect something, a relationship, a future, an image of stability. And every time, I told myself I would matter later. Later never arrived. From the outside, my life looked intact. Nothing was obviously broken. There were no visible disasters, no scandals, no dramatic losses. That was the danger. When nothing is clearly wrong, you learn to ignore the quiet feeling that something is deeply off. I became an expert at managing appearances. I learned how to sound certain even when I felt hollow. I learned how to say the right things while meaning none of them. I learned how to keep moving so no one would ask me to stop and explain. The truth is, I was terrified of ruining everything. Ruining relationships. Ruining plans. Ruining the version of me people believed in. So instead, I ruined myself. It started with small concessions. Choosing what was expected instead of what felt true. Avoiding difficult conversations because they might change things permanently. Telling myself that discomfort was temporary and that commitment meant endurance. At first, it felt manageable. Even noble. But each compromise took something with it. A little energy. A little clarity. A little trust in my own instincts. I didn't notice it happening because the loss was gradual. You don't mourn what disappears one fraction at a time. I stopped paying attention to my reactions. When something hurt, I minimized it. When something felt wrong, I rationalized it. When I felt exhausted, I blamed myself for not being stronger. That became my internal language. You're overreacting. You should be grateful. This is just how life is. I repeated those phrases until they sounded like truth. There were moments when awareness tried to break through. Sudden flashes of clarity in ordinary situations. Standing alone in a room and feeling completely detached from my own life. Watching other people make choices that scared them and realizing I hadn't felt that kind of fear in years. Fear requires desire. I had learned how not to want too much. I stayed in situations that drained me because leaving would have required explanation. I followed paths that felt wrong because turning back would have disappointed people who had invested in my decisions. I told myself that not everyone gets to live authentically. That realism meant compromise. That fulfillment was optional. What I didn't understand yet was that compromise without consent turns into self-betrayal. The first real crack came one evening when I caught myself rehearsing a conversation that would never happen. I was explaining myself to someone who had never asked for the truth. I was justifying choices I hadn't even questioned out loud. That's when I realized something unsettling. I was living defensively, not deliberately. Everything I did was designed to prevent collapse. To avoid conflict. To keep the structure intact. But no one had asked whether the structure was worth preserving. Least of all me. I began to feel tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Not physically, existentially. Like I was carrying a version of myself that no longer fit but couldn't be put down without causing a scene. I felt trapped by my own consistency. People relied on me being who I had always been. Changing felt dangerous, almost unethical. As if becoming honest would somehow erase the good I had already done. So I stayed quiet. That silence became my default. I learned how to swallow reactions before they reached my face. How to agree without engaging. How to disappear while still being present. And the scariest part? People praised me for it. They said I was stable. Dependable. Easy to work with. Easy to be around. I absorbed those compliments like proof that I was doing the right thing. But every compliment felt like a reminder of how invisible I had become. I couldn't remember the last time I had made a decision purely because it felt right. Every choice passed through filters first: impact, optics, consequences, expectations. My own voice came last, if at all. One day, in the middle of an ordinary task, a thought surfaced without warning. if this is my life forever, I won't survive it. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just quietly and completely. That thought scared me because it wasn't panicked. It was calm. Certain. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of ruining everything. I was afraid of finally admitting that what I was protecting no longer included me. And once that truth settled in, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The question was no longer whether something needed to change. It was whether I would keep sacrificing myself to prevent that change from happening. Once that realization settled in, everything I had been holding together began to feel heavier. Not because anything new had happened, but because I could no longer pretend I was okay with the cost. I noticed how often my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A tightness in my chest when I agreed to things I didn't want. A dull ache behind my eyes after conversations where I performed instead of participated. A constant low-level tension, as if I were bracing for something that never arrived. I was living in a permanent state of restraint. I began to understand something unsettling. I wasn't afraid of ruining everything. I was afraid of becoming visible. Of letting people see the parts of me that didn't fit neatly into the life I had constructed. Visibility meant conflict. Conflict meant loss. Loss meant facing the truth that some things only survive because no one challenges them. So I kept challenging myself instead. I became harsher with my own thoughts. Every moment of frustration was met with self-criticism. Every impulse to speak was questioned. I told myself that maturity meant restraint, that control was strength, that wanting less was wisdom. But control without choice is just imprisonment with better lighting. The first real breakdown didn't look like one. There was no crying on the floor, no public collapse. It looked like numbness. Like waking up and realizing I felt nothing about a day that used to matter. I remember standing in front of a mirror one morning and feeling disconnected from the person looking back. Not disgusted. Not angry. Just unfamiliar. As if I were observing someone who had once had plans. That frightened me more than panic ever could. I started fantasizing about escape, not dramatic escape, not reinvention. Just silence. Disappearing long enough that expectations would loosen their grip. Leaving without explanation so I wouldn't have to defend a truth I barely understood myself. The fantasy felt dangerous because it felt merciful. When escape feels like mercy, staying has already become unbearable. I tried to address things indirectly. I changed routines. I took breaks. I distracted myself with productivity and self-improvement, hoping that if I fixed myself enough, the discomfort would resolve on its own. It didn't. Self-improvement became another form of avoidance, a way to stay busy without being honest. The pressure continued to build. Every suppressed truth added weight. Every avoided conversation tightened the space around me. I began to feel like I was living inside a carefully maintained lie, not because the facts were false, but because the narrative excluded me. One night, something inside me finally gave way. I wasn't doing anything important. Just sitting alone, scrolling without absorbing anything. And suddenly, I felt overwhelmed by a sense of futility so strong it took my breath away. I realized that I had been postponing my own life indefinitely, not because I believed things would improve, but because I didn't know how to leave without causing damage. And then it hit me, damage had already been done. It just wasn't visible. The damage was internal. The erosion of self-trust. The loss of agency. The quiet resentment toward a life I had chosen repeatedly while pretending I hadn't. I saw clearly then that my self-sacrifice wasn't noble anymore. It was cowardice disguised as responsibility. I had stayed silent not to protect others, but to avoid the discomfort of change. That realization hurt deeply, but it also brought clarity. I stopped romanticizing endurance. I stopped telling myself that holding everything together made me strong. Strength, I was learning too late, isn't about how much you can suppress. It's about how much truth you can carry without disappearing. I began to test that truth in small, frightening ways. I spoke honestly in moments where I would normally deflect. I admitted confusion instead of presenting certainty. I allowed myself to pause instead of immediately agreeing. Each time, my heart raced. I expected rejection. Anger. Collapse. Most of the time, none of that happened. And that confused me. I realized how much of my fear had been built on anticipation rather than experience. I had been protecting a future disaster that existed mostly in my imagination, while ignoring the present damage that was very real. Still, the cost of honesty wasn't zero. Some people reacted with discomfort. Some withdrew. Some pushed back, trying to reassert the version of me they were used to. I felt guilt rising immediately, the old reflex to retreat, to apologize for existing differently. But something had shifted. I could feel how close I had come to losing myself entirely. That awareness made it harder to retreat. I understood then that leaving, emotionally or physically, wasn't the real escape. The real escape was stopping the pattern of self-erasure. That didn't mean walking away from everything. It meant refusing to keep paying the same price. I was no longer willing to ruin myself to preserve appearances. And yet, I wasn't free. Not yet. Because acknowledging the cost of self-sacrifice is only the beginning. The harder part is accepting that some things will not survive once you stop disappearing for them. That truth hovered in front of me, heavy and unavoidable. I knew then that the final choice wasn't about escape. It was about responsibility, for my voice, my limits, and the life I had been quietly destroying in the name of peace. And once you see that, there's no going back to pretending that silence is kindness. The moment I stopped ruining myself didn't feel triumphant. It felt exposed. When you spend years holding everything together, people grow comfortable with the shape of your silence. They mistake your restraint for agreement, your endurance for consent. The first time you speak honestly, it doesn't sound brave to them. It sounds disruptive. I learned that quickly. I didn't make announcements. I didn't demand understanding. I simply stopped disappearing in conversations that mattered. I stated limits without apologizing for them. I named discomfort instead of smoothing it over. I chose clarity over harmony, even when my voice shook. The reactions varied. Some people listened. Some didn't recognize me anymore. Some tried to negotiate me back into my old shape. That was the hardest part, realizing how much of my value had been tied to my willingness to absorb pressure quietly. When I stopped doing that, the balance changed. And change makes people uncomfortable. I felt guilt immediately. A deep, familiar guilt that whispered I was being selfish, dramatic, ungrateful. That voice had trained me well. It had kept me small for years. This time, I didn't obey it. I sat with the guilt until it stopped being a command and became information. I learned to ask a different question when it showed up: is this guilt telling me I'm wrong, or just that I'm no longer invisible? The answer was almost always the same. I lost some things. Not catastrophically, but definitively. Certain connections loosened. Certain expectations evaporated. A few relationships revealed themselves to be conditional in ways I hadn't wanted to see. That hurt more than I expected. But it also clarified something important: anything that only survives while you erase yourself is not stability. It's dependency dressed as peace. I grieved what I couldn't keep. I grieved the time I had given away thinking it was protection. I grieved the version of myself who believed that being good meant being silent. Grief became my teacher. It taught me that regret isn't just about what you did wrong. It's about what you didn't allow yourself to want. It showed me how easily a life can be reduced to maintenance if you're afraid to risk disruption. I didn't suddenly become fearless. I became honest. Honesty is quieter than courage. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps asking you to show up as you are, even when the outcome is uncertain. Especially then. I started making decisions without rehearsing every possible reaction. I accepted that some choices would disappoint people, and that disappointment wasn't a moral failure. It was a consequence of being real in a world that prefers predictability. There were days I missed my old invisibility. It had been comfortable. It had shielded me from conflict and from choice. But I also remembered the cost, the numbness, the resentment, the slow disappearance of my own voice. I couldn't go back to that. Not after realizing how close I had come to living an entire life without ever standing inside it. The most painful truth I had to accept was this: I wasn't afraid of ruining everything. I was afraid of changing the rules that kept me safe but small. Once I changed those rules, everything shifted. Not dramatically, but permanently. My life didn't become easier. It became mine. That difference matters. I no longer measure success by how intact things look from the outside. I measure it by how present I am inside my own choices. I no longer confuse peace with avoidance or kindness with self-erasure. I learned, too late but not uselessly, that you don't protect a life by disappearing inside it. You protect it by participating, even when participation costs you comfort. If someone listening to this recognizes themselves in my confession, hear this clearly: you don't ruin everything by speaking your truth. You ruin yourself by never letting it exist. There will be losses. There always are. Some paths won't reopen. Some people won't adjust. Some versions of you will never be lived. But what remains, the part of you that finally stops hiding, is worth the price. I was afraid to ruin everything. So I ruined myself instead. Now, even when the ground feels unstable, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed, I choose presence over preservation. Because a life held together by silence is already broken. And I refuse to disappear politely ever again.